We live in an era where mythology and animation are almost inseparable. Whether a show is directly talking about angels and demons, or if robots are used to represent them, there always seems to be some kind of mythological commentary running underneath the story. And when it comes to Christian-inspired storytelling in animation, there are usually two approaches. The first and less seen approach is actually the pro-Christian narrative, where the story isn't just using Christian symbols or themes, but is actively trying to reinforce Christian beliefs. A new example of this is Gabriel and the Guardians, an indie animated series following the Archangel Gabriel as he leaves the Garden of Paradise to fight against evil on Earth. It's a biblical type story with a clear moral structure, following the classic battle of good versus evil, with God being aligned with good. Then there is the second approach, which I don't want to call the anti-Christian approach, but which I will for the sake of this video. At the end of the day, however, none of these projects are necessarily anti-Christian, and the idea is more so that they're outside of the Christian bubble, using symbols popular within Christianity, which the mainstream culture will recognize and identify, but not making something necessarily meant to appeal to Christians where their existing ideas. These stories can still appeal to Christians, but the idea is more so to challenge what Christianity is today, assuming there's any intent at all. But that often tends to lead to the anti-Christian approach actually being more popular with Christians and non-Christians. So today I want to talk about why with the two examples of Gabriel and the Guardians and the Helluverse. With Gabriel and the Guardians, you get a very biblical story that, at least so far, is very much played safe. It's set in a time before the Great Flood that only Noah and his descendants would eventually survive. The world before the flood is one of the most fascinating eras of those who study mythology, described in the Bible as a corrupt age following humanity's banishment from the Garden of Eden. This was a time when giants ruled the land, enslaving humans and shaping civilization in ways lost to history. These giants, or Nephilim, were the offspring of the fallen angels who would take human wives, a concept not too different from Hazbin Hotel's Lucifer and Lilith, where a fallen being chooses a human partner. In Gabriel and the Guardians, the Garden of Eden, here called the Garden of Paradise, is protected by Gabriel and his animal companion. The first episode introduces us to the kingdom of Kainar on Earth, which appears to be the descendants of Cain, or Cain in the original Hebrew, from the Bible, the firstborn son of Adam who was known for killing his brother. The show also introduces the giants, who enslave humanity and are sometimes even worshipped as gods, an idea deeply rooted in ancient biblical and mythological traditions. The episode ends with Gabriel battling one of these giants as they attempt to breach the Garden of Paradise. In the process, he falls to the earth, finding himself in a world far darker than he realized, setting up a clear journey for our hero, who will have to navigate the horrors of the pre-flood civilization, as well as his own personal growth. Now, to be fair, it's hard to compare this one episode to the multiple seasons and multiple shows that VivziePop has developed with her own characters in Hazbin Hotel and Helluva Boss. But one thing that stands out is the potential limitations that come with adhering so closely to biblical storytelling. The show isn't afraid to get into extra biblical sources like the Book of Enoch, but in doing so, at least so far, it mostly focuses on a very Christian perspective from the modern times, which is often rather uneducated. Like I said, the show has room to grow, but even with how great this show seems so far, it seems to be part of a trend that feels almost like an echo chamber. Unlike Gabriel and the Guardians, which focuses on a biblical narrative and the perspective of angels, Hazbin Hotel was never meant to adhere to Christian canon in any way. Instead, it becomes a commentary on Christianity itself by focusing on demons living in hell. VivziePop has openly stated that Hazbin Hotel was inspired by Paradise Lost, the famous epic poem by John Milton, which tells the story of Lucifer's rebellion and fall from grace. In Paradise Lost, Lucifer is not portrayed as an ultimate force of evil, but rather someone who just disagrees with God and is demonized because of it. This leads to his exile from heaven, where he becomes an active antagonist in God's plans by trying to sabotage the Garden of Eden by giving the fruit of forbidden knowledge to Adam and Eve. The story doesn't treat God as the ultimate evil either, but as someone who is using his own moral standard in order to define what is right and what is wrong. The story was seen largely as a commentary on the church in the time of Milton, with Milton essentially casting himself as Lucifer because he felt rejected by the church because of his different ideas, treated as evil instead of someone with just different moral opinions. We see the inspirations for this in Hazbin Hotel, where heaven is not representing an actual heaven, but rather the modern Christians of today. The demons, meanwhile, are generally people who feel rejected by that system. A great example of this is Angel Dust, who, despite being named after a drug technically, is named Angel in order for us to see him as the ultimate soul needing redemption. He is called Angel, but he lives in hell. It's easy for young gay men who have been pushed out by the church and by their own parents who were religious to empathize with Angel, to see themselves in him and see him as a symbol for what they've gone through in their own lives. Charlie, meanwhile, becomes a stand-in for Vivziepop, just as Lucifer was a stand-in for Milton in Paradise Lost. She gets to have the experience of being surrounded by people like Angel and not understanding why they're rejected by the church, much less by their own families just because they're a part of the church. A big criticism of the church today is that they've become focused on the Old Testament as opposed to the New Testament. This is alarming because Jesus Christ in the New Testament actually disavows the interpretation of the Old Testament to call other people sinners. The entirety of his story in the four Gospels is Jesus refuting everything the Pharisee says about which people deserve judgment and even execution. A great example of this is in John chapter 8, verse 3, where a woman caught in adultery is brought before Jesus by the scribes and Pharisees. They remind him that, according to their law, such a woman should be stoned. Instead of endorsing their judgment, however, Jesus responds saying he without sin should be the first to throw a stone at her. This is meant to emphasize that everyone has sin, and the point of the system is not to judge others who may have more sin than you. Instead, Jesus says that he doesn't condemn her and asks her to sin no more. Now, this is not how the entirety of Christianity acts today, but whether you call it a vocal minority or a large portion of the population while still not being all of it, it makes for ripe commentary on what Christianity is at least seen as today. One that reinforces the ideas that it should be what Jesus originally preached. According to Jesus, it was the Pharisees, the Jewish priestly class, who were actually stopping others from entering heaven. Not that different from the actual heaven in Has-Been Hotel. With that in mind, stories like Has-Been Hotel and Paradise Lost can feel more intensely Christian to Christian people because it ends up appealing to them with the same themes while presenting the characters as demons or sinners. Now, with that in mind, we still may actually see something like this pan out in Gabriel and the Guardians. The story begins with Gabriel in the Garden of Paradum, and when he looks down at the earth, he wonders what it's like for the people below the dark cloud, or if they even still exist. When he gets down there, he's going to see that it's a place of chaos and turmoil, with lots of humans being enslaved by the giants. And if I had to guess, a large part of the narrative is going to be Gabriel questioning why things are the way they are, why the humans can't be helped more or even let into the Garden of Paradum so that they can be away from the giants and their evil reign. Even if the show doesn't pan out quite this way, it still is an amazing watch, so if you haven't seen it, you should go check it out over on Angel Studios to help support the show. Its cast includes Johnny Young Bosch and even Christina V, who most of you know as Verostica from Helluva Boss. Or go check out my previous video breaking down the first episode in more detail. See you guys there. Man, I do love running, especially when it's away from women who are madly in love with me. But one thing I never run from is another man. Well, 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 if it isn't my arch rival, Racer Rabbit. Shady the Bat, you're here for the magic crystal as well?